Hello, welcome to Story Hour with Miss Barbara. When I was young, my favorite place to visit was the library because I love to read books. And I especially love stories about horses and about mountain men. Those were the wild men of the West who traveled in our country before when only Native Americans were living there. And they were very adventuresome. But one of my favorite books of all was a book by a man named Ernest Thompson Seaton. And I'll never forget that name, even though it's so long. And I loved his book called Wild Animals I Have Known. This book was filled with stories of real wild animals that Mr. Seaton had observed in nature, and he was very astute in watching animals and seeing things from their point of view. But he was not always like this. The first story in the book is called Lobo, the Wolf of Currumpaw County. And in this story, Mr. Seaton is the bad guy. You see, back in the 1800s, people were just settling the West, and they were taking the land to make ranches for sheep and cattle. And because of this, they chased off or hunted and killed many of the wild animals, like the deer and the elk, that were the game, the food for the wolves. And so what could the wolves do? Steal the farmers, the ranchers' sheep and cattle. It was easy pickings for them. And so the ranchers were determined to wipe out these wolves. They wanted all the wolves gone. But there was one particular wolf pack that was very difficult to erase. And that's because it was led by a great wolf, a Mexican gray wolf that they named Lobo, which is the Spanish word for wolf. This wolf was so smart, there was nothing they could do to get rid of his pack. He protected them very well and was able to get the food that they needed. So, what did the ranchers do? They did what all the kings in the fairy tale stories we've read do. They put out a call for someone to take on this job. And the prize was not the rancher's daughter. The prize was $1,000. Yes, they put a bounty of $1,000 on the head of Lobo, the wolf. And in those days, in the 1800s, this was a lot of money. Maybe $10,000 now or $100,000, I'm not sure. But it was a big prize. And there was one man who was very good at trapping and hunting animals who felt that he would get that prize. And the promise of big bucks lured Ernest Thompson Seaton to this farmer's ranch where Lobo and all the farmers nearby, where Lobo was their enemy, their nemesis. Well, Mr. Seaton figured out it would take him about 4 days to get rid of this problem. First thing he did was he set out bait. He took some deer meat and cut it up, and he very carefully buried poison into the meat in different places that no animal would be able to detect. And then he put it out where he saw the tracks of Lobo's pack, carefully spreading it out. And then he went home And the next day he was eager to see what he had caught, what he had killed, hopefully Lobo. So as he came near the places where he had set out the bait, he saw lots of wolf tracks. Oh, he was very optimistic. But no dead bodies anywhere. In fact, he finally found the deer meat, just little pieces, the pieces that had the poison in, had been carefully cut out by the wolves' teeth and put in a pile, and then they pooped on it. Yes, it was no accident. They were giving Mr. Seaton a clear message. This is what we think of your feeble attempts to trick us. Well, back to the drawing board for Mr. Seaton. So he went to the next level up, traps. And there were some very new modern traps coming out from Mexico. So he invested in those traps. So now he was invested in this scheme. He was getting very serious. He had to get that money. So he very carefully put out the traps where he knew the wolves visited, and he disguised them with brush and branches and leaves, carefully covered up all his scent, all his tracks, and then he waited. But when he went out to check his traps, he found that each one had been sprung, but there was no wolf trapped. Maybe a stone had been thrown in or a stick had been poked in. These wolves were very clever. And so this little task that Mr. Seaton thought would take about 4 days began to extend into months, until finally the snow was falling and he still had no results. This Lobo had led his pack very sagely around all his traps and tricks. Then one day, Ernest Thompson Seaton was studying Lobo's tracks. He recognized them now. They were the biggest ones. And he noticed something. There were some smaller tracks that Lobo's tracks were following. And Mr. Seaton thought, aha, this must be his mate. And sure enough, it was. Word had spread about this white wolf, named by the ranchers Blanca, which means white in Spanish. And this must be Lobo's mate. So Mr. Seaton thought, I will catch him through his mate. I think I found his weak spot. So he set out traps where he knew the female was likely to go. He had studied her trails carefully. And sure enough, one day he and his men came upon one of their traps, and there was the white wolf, trapped horribly. She was moaning and crying. And when they approached, Lobo was right there by her side. But as they got nearer, he went away a little distance, hiding in the brush, but he was still watching. Well, mercilessly, Ernest Thompson Seaton and his men killed Blanca, and they took her body out of the trap and took it back to the ranch. And Lobo followed from a distance to see where that was. And that night, Mr. Seaton heard the most pitiful wolf howling that he had ever heard. all night long. Pitiful howls. It was Lobo crying for his mate, Blanca. So, Mr. Seaton thought, now I will catch Lobo through his mate, Blanca. So he cut up her dead body into pieces and spread them around and put traps where he put them. And lured by the smell of his mate, Lobo lost his caution. He was in grief, and he wasn't himself. And sure enough, one day they found him, 1 foot caught in each trap, 4 different traps. He was really caught. But for some reason, Mr. Seaton and his men could not kill this noble wolf who stood there proud. And so they put a burlap bag over his head and tied him up, took him off of the traps, and carried him back to the ranch. And Mr. Seaton set him up in a cage, and he gave him some food and some water. But Lobo would have nothing to do with that human food. He just lay there with his head on his paws, looking out from the cage, looking out over the prairie where he had led his pack and lived his life. And the next morning, they found Lobo dead. Apparently, he had died of grief. And so Mr. Seaton got his $1,000 reward. But for some reason, he couldn't get Lobo out of his head. He started thinking about this wolf that surprised him. He wasn't the savage wild animal that he had expected. He was wise, and he was caring, and he was a great leader, and he was noble and proud. And so Mr. Seaton began to see wild animals in a new light. He began to look at them from their point of view, from what life was like for them. And he used his great tracking skills not to hunt the animals, but to study them. And so he wrote his famous book, and his life was changed, and many other lives were changed through his book as they read about the wild animal stories that he wrote. And these were people in America and in Europe. And people's attitudes about wild animals began to change. And so this is the story of Lobo, the wolf of Currumpaw County. Here's one final picture for you of this noble wolf howling. Blackbird singing in the dead of night, take these broken wings and learn to fly. All your life, you were only waiting for this moment to arise. You were only waiting for this moment to arise. Blackbird singing in the dead of night, take these sunken eyes and learn to see. All your life, you were only waiting for this moment to be free. You were only waiting for this moment to be free. Blackbird, fly into the light of the dark black night. Blackbird sitting on the edge of night, take this damaged heart and learn to give. You were only waiting for this moment to believe. You were only waiting for this moment to believe. Blackbird, fly into the lightning sky. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story of a wolf. And I hope that Paul McCartney will forgive me for adding a verse to his song, but it just seemed to fit my story. Thank you.